Hi everyone, thank you for coming. We're going to be having Sharon Wilson, the historian at the Hostess House, present for us today. She's been the historian there for 20 years. She's going to be talking about the 8 literary connections of the Hostess House. And from the sneak peek that she has given us, it's very interesting. There is a lot of very interesting figures from Marion who are attached to the Hostess House who we're looking forward to hear her talk about. And for future events like this, please check our Facebook and Instagram. We'll be posting the video recording of this on Facebook for our YouTube channel, and we'll be posting other events in the future on Facebook. So, take it away, Sharon.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, I'll tell you the way this came about, that I found the literary connections, was there was a book written, we'll talk about later, by Herb Russell, and he talked about the Hostess House being on the National Register of Historic Places because of its architecture. And that's true. Samuel Plato, the African-American, very talented architect, was the one who did design the house. And that is the reason that it is on the National Register. And he said it wasn't because of the literary connections. Well, he was looking at literary connections because he was working on researching Edgar Lee Masters, who was an author that he was very interested in. So then when he said that, I thought, well, okay, I know he's researching this one author, and I knew the lady of the house. She's pictured here in her study. And if you go to the Hostess House, I think probably most of you, not all, but most of you have been to the Hostess House. So you've probably seen this room that we've replicated to look the way it did in 1912. And this is Peggy sitting at her desk. She has a wall of pictures behind her of all the famous people that she knows and she's friends with. She has a skull here that we think maybe has something to do with the Shakespeare Hamlet type meaning. And she had a Buddha on her desk and all these things. So that was the reason that we want to look at her for a little bit later on, because she had also written a book called The Fruit of Toils. So I knew of 2 connections. So I thought, well, are there more? So I started looking into things, and I came here to the library when I started my research, and I did a lot of work here. And I used the microfilm downstairs, and I went through hours and hours and hours of microfilm to find things. And so I did find some other things, and some people led me into little ways of finding out other things as well. So I'm going to talk to you about the 8 connections that I've found so far. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Marie Webster. And I've got some pictures up here that you might want to look at afterwards, get a closer look, but I've got them kind of in order the way I'm going to talk. So the very first picture down there in the end is Marie Webster. And you see a picture of her there, and actually she's on the rooftop garden of the Hostess House. When the house was built, there was a rooftop garden at the very top. And so Peggy had a lot of parties up there. And when you come up, if you look at it, the lady that's standing behind the bench, the tallest person back here, that's Marie. And then down in the picture, there are other people who were dressed in costumes. That was the way people did things then for fun. And the one with the veil on is Peggy. So let me tell you a little bit about Marie Webster. Marie was born in 1859 in Wabash, Indiana. She was the salutatorian of her class, and she graduated from Union High School in Wabash. On Valentine's Day of 1884, she was married to George Webster by the Wabash Presbyterian minister. They moved to Marion. It was said that George was respected for his many manly and social qualities. At that time, George was a cashier at the Sweetser Bank, and he continued to climb the ladder of success in the banking world. Their only child, Lawrence, was born late that year, and Marie led a devoted life to her family and defined by social duties, volunteer activities, and hours spent reading, sewing, and performing amateur dramatics. The family traveled widely in this country and abroad. George was afflicted with rheumatoid arthritis that crippled him terribly, and he was forced into retirement in 1910. It was at this time that Marie was looking for a hobby that would occupy more of her time, as she was home caring for George. Gathering flowers from her backyard garden, she would dry and press them and then trace their shapes. As she arranged and rearranged them, patterns began to emerge. She cut gracefully contoured patches from pastel linen, capturing the natural beauty of each kind of flower. When the hand applique work was finished, she took a quilt top to an elderly women's residence nearby, which would have been Emily Flynn. You remember Emily Flynn a little bit? To have them quilted with her original designs. Her first quilt was met with admiration by local friends and family that she was persuaded to send it to the offices of the Ladies' Home Journal. Remember the Ladies' Home Journal? At the time, the publication was very much promoting the arts and crafts movement. Her quilt encompassed all the elements of this movement. The muted colors revealed a simple beauty that appealed to people as they stripped their homes of fussy Victorian trappings. Her quilts were a clean break from 19th century elaborate, intricately designed applique quilts. By 1911, 4 of her quilts were featured in the January issue in full color. Edward Bach, the editor, was at the forefront of the arts and clubs movement and was responsible for bringing her work to the attention of the nation. In 1912, Doubleday asked her to write a book. After much preparation and research, Marie completed Quilts, Their Story, and How to Make Them, and it was published in 1915. This was, and is, the landmark study on quilting. By the 1920s, Marie continued to be inundated with requests for her quilt patterns. She asked 2 of her friends to help, and they formed the Patchwork Quilt Company. For the next 2 decades, Marie operated a flourishing cottage industry out of an extra bedroom on the 2nd floor of her home. Then widowed, she indulged her passion for travel once again. At the age of 83, she decided to retire and left practical patchwork in others' hands and moved to Princeton, New Jersey with her son and family. "I never want to see another quilt," Marie announced to her daughter-in-law. "I never want to see another quilt," and she enjoyed reading, gardening, and the opera she loved as well. She stayed very active until at 97 she died of a stroke. Today it is a wonder how this woman, born in mid-19th century Wabash, Indiana, could be so completely a 20th century, or now 21st century woman in her outlook. So modern is her creativity, and to have had so much influence, even indirectly, to the present. The spread of her patterns, even when no longer bearing the names she originally gave them, or when she was no longer acknowledged as the original design source, has been phenomenal. And when I was researching people, and I didn't know who Mrs. George Webster was, and I kept finding her name with Peggy's in the society columns and in little things where they were traveling together, going to the opera in Indianapolis. And it took me a long time to figure out, well, who is Mrs. George Webster? And then I found out it was Marie Webster. So they were good friends, and her son Lawrence was actually a friend of Peggy's as well. And he was the same age as Peggy. They were both born in the same year. And so I had found, of course, well, in fact, Marie's granddaughter, Rosalind Webster Perry, was the one who gave me that picture, and she also gave me a letter that Peggy had written to her father. So they were close friends. So that was the first connection that I have for 1915. And the Wilsons by then are in their house. They moved into their house in 1912, so they've been there a couple years. And then comes along Louise Ayres Garnett. And that's the second picture up there. And I'll tell you about her. In 1877, Louise was born to Mr. and Mrs. Lafayette Ayres in Plymouth, Indiana. She was educated at the Dearborn Seminary of Chicago and Northwestern University. At some point, the family moved to Marion, but it may have been after Louise's marriage in 1900. In 1906, she and her husband Eugene moved to Evanston, Illinois, where they remained for the rest of their married life. She wrote children's poetry and plays, and she became a collaborator of Dr. Henry Hadley. Hadley was a conductor and composer, and he met Louise when he was conducting the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. They worked on many pieces together, she doing the text and Hadley doing the music. At some point, Louise met Peggy Wilson. Perhaps it was when she was visiting her parents in Marion. The society columns would mention that Louise was a house guest of Peggy's. In early 1916, Louise had a book published titled Master Will of Stratford by Macmillan Company. This play consists of a prologue, 3 acts, and an epilogue. The scene is set at Stratford-on-Avon, and the neighborhood where Will is 12 years old. There are 28 characters, and various others were needed to perform a Morris dance, and a Morris dance was something like a maypole dance. The play is 105 pages long, and there is a lengthy glossary added to the conclusion. In March of 1916, this notice appeared in the Marion paper. It says, read Louise Ayres Garnett's play. The Sans Souci Club had an unusually interesting meeting at the home of Mrs. J. Wood Wilson Wednesday afternoon, when Master Will of Stratford, a play written by Louise Ayres Garnett, was the reading. This work has just been published by Macmillan and Company of New York, and was obtained through Mrs. Wilson, whom Mrs. Garnett had told that she was engaged in the writing of the production some time ago. It has never been staged, but it has received good criticisms, and it is beautiful, quite a little masterpiece in fact. It is a story of Shakespeare's boyhood and a dream that he had. And then that was in March, and then in May there's another article that came out in the Marion Leader Tribune, and this announces that Louise Ayres' play was presented in Indianapolis. And it also mentions again that it had been performed at Peggy's house. So and I want to say that on this picture wall that Peggy had, Marie Webster's, we put her picture there, and we put Louise Ayres Garnett's picture there. And actually we put Henry Hadley, the one that she wrote the text for his music, his picture is there. We assume that, I don't know for sure whose pictures were on that wall, except for maybe one or two, but I'm pretty sure that they could have been very well put there. Now, her obituary discloses that she was very interested in cultural affairs of Evanston, stating that she had joined the drama club and a reading circle. She would often share her poetry at various clubs in the community. She wrote 75 songs and many plays and one novel titled The Joyous Pretender. Her husband, son, daughter, and granddaughter survived her. She died of heart disease October 31st, 1937 at the age of 60. So there we have her. Now, all right, then number 3 is Peggy Wilson. And Peggy Wilson wrote The Fruit of Toil in 1916, and it was published by Bobbs Merrill. Now, Bobbs Merrill used to be a fine publishing company in Indianapolis. I don't know if you remember that name or not, but it was a good one. Lillian, familiarly called Peggy, was the original hostess at 723 West 4th Street. A school teacher in nearby Wabash, she married in 1911 to wealthy banker J. Wood Wilson, 30 years her senior. In fact, he was just the same age as her father. Her father was 30 years older than her. Peggy, always with a flair for the dramatic, seemed to gravitate to theatrical and literary types. It is known that she met and befriended many celebrities in the arts, and that's true, she did. As Mrs. Wilson, she now had the funds to support a grand lifestyle that included extensive travel as well as the leisure time to pursue writing as an avocation. And she would often say to her husband, she said, well, I'd like to go to New York, and she'd call him Daddy, and he would give her $2,000, which was a lot of money back then, and she would go off for a couple weeks and then come back and go other places too. So this little volume that she wrote, it's a small little book up here, you can look at it later, but that little volume that she wrote, she dedicated to J. Wood Wilson, and his name was J. Nothing, it's just J. Wood and Wilson. There was no, sometimes people want to make it Woodrow, but it's just Wood, that was his name, J. Wood Wilson. So she had this flair for the dramatics, and now she has all this money. So she's got this little book that she's had printed, and recurring themes are obvious when the entire collection has been read. The playwright frequently deals with these topics, with death, aging, and unrequited love. They're all kind of sad. They're kind of really downers. The mood in each is somber and tends to be melodramatic. 3 to 5 characters make up the cast in these stage plays. And you know, if you've been to the Hostess House on the 3rd floor, there's a stage. And so I'm sure that they performed, I know they performed plays there, but I'm sure they performed some of her plays as well. Some of the titles are An Episode, Being the Fly, A Voice on the Stair, The Weight of Wings, and Living. The following article appeared in the Wabash Times-Star and was reprinted in the Marion Leader Tribune, October 14, 1916. Mrs. Wilson's book. Mrs. J. Wood Wilson of Marion, née Miss Lillian Pampel, of this city, has just recently completed a book entitled The Fruit of Toil, which is dedicated to her husband, Mr. J. Wood Wilson. The book is composed of a few short one-act plays, which are very interesting. Many friends in this city received copies of the book Wednesday, so she passed her book around to a lot of people. Now, it just so happened that J. Wood died just a week later after this notice came out. Peggy at that time was away visiting her friends in New York, and she was called to tell them that she was told that he was ill. So she came home right away, but he passed away the day before she got there. So it was known that Peggy liked to spend part of her day writing in the study on the 2nd floor of her Marion home. Later, when she was involved with Edgar Lee Masters, she wrote some rough drafts of plays to be created from his literary work, but none ever came to fruition. It could be assumed that her little theatricals were produced in her own 3rd floor theater. As no other publications had been discovered, this was apparently the only writing of Peggy's that was actually put into book form. So next we come to Edgar Lee Masters. And he's pictured right here. And this was the reason I found some of this, started searching for it, was because he's mentioned in his biography by Herb Russell. So we might spend just a little more time on Edgar Lee Masters. Edgar Lee Masters was born in 1869. He moved from Kansas to Illinois at a young age. He was intrigued by the written word and studied foreign languages, particularly Greek. Although he entered the profession of law, he was constantly writing poetry. Some of it was published, but not to any great acclaim. In 1915, he wrote Spoon River Anthology, which was a runaway bestseller. Just like we have bestsellers today, Spoon River Anthology was that way. This collection of poetry was written as the confessions of some 200 souls who were buried in the town cemetery. Scholars of literature were fascinated with the novel approach that Masters had perfected in Spoon River. He was immediately catapulted into fame. When Edgar met Peggy Wilson in 1919, now she was a widow, she was a wealthy, still young widow, and she was in Chicago visiting friends when in 1919 in a dance she met Edgar Lee Masters. He was still riding high on his literary lion status, and he reveled in his celebrated notoriety. He was smitten with Peggy, and immediately a romance blossomed. Apparently, Masters had a weakness for pretty women, and he was not new to these kinds of involvements. Many visits to the Marion house, and within 3 weeks he was at the Marion house knocking on the door, and secret rendezvous out of town were frequently on Masters' agenda. Of course, because he felt he had met his soulmate, he decided he wanted to marry his soulmate. And so, didn't bother him, didn't bother her that he was a married man. He'd been married for 20 years, had 3 children, and he was often attracted to other women, but Peggy, he thought, was really the one. Of course, she was also the wealthy Peggy. But anyway, he decides that he's going to divorce his wife. So he files suit. Now, Edgar Lee Masters was a lawyer by profession before he started his writing. And his law partner at one time was Clarence Darrow. Now, a lot of people today have no idea who I mean by Clarence Darrow, but I think probably most people here remember the defense attorney, Clarence Darrow. So his wife, Edgar Lee Masters' wife, hires Clarence Darrow to be her attorney. And he saw to it that this divorce proceedings, because then it was different. You had to go through a trial and all these things. It was not the way you can do it quickly today. But he saw to it that this took several years. Peggy was very nervous that she might be called as a witness. So she packed up and went to Europe for a year, had her sister come and stay at her house while she was gone. And Edgar Lee, at the end of this time, was financially broken by Clarence Darrow, and pretty much remained financially broken, even though he wrote volumes and volumes, but just didn't sell like Spoon River. And so then Peggy came back, and she was no longer interested in him. So the reason I got him up here is because of this book that he wrote then in 1924 called Mirage. Now, Mirage was a very thinly disguised story of Peggy and his romance. So he had written some other books where he put her in the stories as a Becky Norris before this, but now he decides he's going to write a tell-all novel. And she'd been a minor character in his books before, but now he's made her a major character. So since the romance had dimmed, his divorce proceedings are over, and he decides he's going to tell all. So now the character of Becky Norris had a major share of the pages in this book, and anyone who knew the Wilson mansion and Peggy would not have had to stretch their imaginations very far to make the connection between the two. The local community knew that the famous Edgar Lee Masters was often in Marion visiting the widow of J. Wood Wilson, and they were scandalized by the couple's behavior. If there had been any doubts in the minds of Peggy's neighbors, this novel clearly left nothing in the shadows. Mirage attempts to show Becky in all her failings. There are many details that can be documented as fact. Masters seemed to use his first-hand knowledge rather than his creative abilities with the writing of this fictional piece. It is clearly obvious that Masters was trying to vent his frustrations with this tell-all book. Surely it must have been an embarrassment to Peggy to have items revealed such as her age, for she was subtracting years, her hair color, for she was tinting her tresses, her love life, revealing she had affairs while her husband was still alive. And the late Mr. Norris, Becky's husband, left a will almost identical to J. Wood's. What a coincidence. Once this tale was put in print, it must have been clear to Masters that he would no longer be welcome at what he called the Sleeping Palace. For he had called Peggy his magic princess, who lived in the Sleeping Palace. Finally, Masters had his divorce. He moved to New York and continued to write. And Edgar remarried. And although Masters, like I said, was a prolific writer, none of his books ever achieved the attention or the rave reviews that Spoon River had. And never again did Masters become financially secure. He was a broken man in many ways. Edgar Lee Masters died in 1950 at the age of 81. And I'm going to read you one of the paragraphs out of the book Mirage. And I'm reading this because if you've been to the house and you've been to Peggy's study, this is describing Peggy's study. So you can tell if you've been in that room that he had too. And so Kirby entered, walking sadly along the stairway with its many betrayals of absence of the careful mistress, whose artist eyes and hand made everything beautiful where she was. "It will be in the library," said Kirby, and Nora answered, "Come up and look." And he went, standing first at the door to scan the photographs on the wall. The Buddha on the library table, everything that spoke of Becky, and his own picture on the wall too, in its place of honor at the center of the other photographs. Logs were on the fire, ready to light, and the tall golden bottle of brandy from which he and Becky had drunk in the cool days after walks, after his return from cold rides, stood in its place on the table, reminding him of happiness that was gone, never perhaps to return. And in the silver dish by the bottle there were English walnuts, with the silver cracker lying on them. How often they had taken a brandy and then eased its sting by eating walnuts, which they had cracked for each other. And here in this couch in front of the fireplace, what long evenings together in each other's arms, looking into the flames in a bliss, a peace that cannot be told, and perhaps can only be lived briefly before they go forever. So if you go to that room, you'll see there's a little dish of walnuts there, and there's the bottle that could be brandy in it. So those are the reasons why some of these are where they are, because we've read things like this. So that is Edgar Lee Masters. So now we come to Dr. John Colin Vaughn. Now I'm going to take this down, and I've got another poster behind this. We don't hear much about Jay Wood, do we? Except that he was rich. But in this, Dr. Vaughn will talk about him. And I've got this, I didn't really plan to talk about this, but he was born on board a ship. His father was a sea captain, and they traveled the world before he moved on the ship. And he then went to medical school at Columbia University. But he stopped his education for different periods. And one time he went to a Smithsonian expedition to the cliff-dwelling ruins of Colorado. He went to Alaska to pan for gold, and he learned how to drive his sled dogs to Dawson and Nome. And then he also, the second expedition to the North Pole hadn't been reached yet in 1903, and he went on that expedition that was from 1903, and because he knew how to drive the sled dogs. Some people thought it was because of his medicine, but it was really the sled dogs. So he went on that expedition, and they no sooner got started, a short while they got started, and an ice floe came along and destroyed their ship. They were able to get all their animals and food and supplies off, but they were stranded for 19 months. It was a long time. It was a real disaster before they were discovered. So that was his background before he became a doctor. Then he went back to school and he finished his degree and he started being a surgeon. So I'll tell you some other things about him. Less than 4 years after he wrote this book, textbook on minor surgery, and it does have a lot of pictures in there I don't even care to look at, but they're surgical kind of pictures. Dr. Vaughn arrived at the Marion Mansion, and he made Peggy his third wife. Although he had a private practice in New York at the time, he was beginning to lighten his schedule, and the couple had plans to spend more time in Marion. By 1928, Vaughn had retired from his practice, and he and Peggy made Marion their permanent home. Later, in 1930, he again went into private practice, this time in Marion. He remained active in his profession until 1939, when his health prevented him from continuing. And when he was in Marion and he had his office here, it was in the Marion National Bank building, which is now Ridley Tower. He had an illustrious career in New York. His credits are lengthy and noteworthy. Here are some of the positions that he held. Following his 1907 graduation from Columbia Medical College, he was a director and visiting surgeon at Beekman Street Hospital, visiting surgeon at Sing Sing Prison, consulting surgeon Manhattan Eye and Ear Hospital, consulting surgeon Workers' Health Bureau, and instructor in minor surgery at Columbia Medical College. The book is illustrated with 459 engravings. There are 23 chapters that include these topics: general injuries to the soft parts, special surgical conditions of the trunk, fractures and dislocations of the hand and arm, minor surgery on the foot, and bandaging. It's my understanding this book was used for many, many years. The dedication of the book is as follows. This book is dedicated to the nurses of America, without whose patience, skill, and devotion to duty, surgery could not have reached its present high level, and to one Ella Holcomb, whose kindly ways and love of humanity brought comfort and courage to thousands of sufferers during her long service at the Vanderbilt Clinic. This is an interesting dedication, for in 1950, Peggy wrote to Elizabeth Hamilton Fryermuth, "I was for years here in New York while Dr. Vaughn was ill, going from one hospital after another, then back to my apartment where I nursed him. He had a horror of trained nurses." Peggy also had her Christian Science doctors look in on Dr. Vaughn in his final days. Although Peggy was indeed in New York for years, Dr. Vaughn came to reside with her in 1939. And Peggy was back and forth. She was in New York a lot, but she did come back to Marion every once in a while. Dr. Vaughn died in January of 1940 at the age of 65. He is buried in the Wilson Mausoleum in the old IWF Cemetery in Marion, where Jay Wood is buried. So, then we go on to Harriet Vaughn Davies, who is Dr. Vaughn's sister. She also grew up on board the ship. And the ship that they were on was called a square rigger. And I had my son draw up a little picture. This is what a square rigger looked like. So they were traveling in this in the 1880s and 1890s, I believe. So they liked being on that ship. They preferred that to being on land, they said. So Harriet Vaughn was born aboard the square rigger that her Canadian father sailed to many foreign ports. Harriet was born in 1879 while the ship was battling a storm off the coast of Argentina. Her brother John Collin had been born in 1875, and that's Dr. Vaughn, off the coast of, he was born off the coast of Maine, and her oldest brother, Chad, was born in London in 1873. The children of Captain Vaughn and his wife Anne from Calais, Maine. It looks like Calais. You know how the French name town is Calais? It looks like that, but they told me in Maine it's pronounced Calais. Calais, Maine grew up on board this ship and considered it home. Dr. Vaughn's sister wrote this book describing the life that she and her brothers had known on board the ship. In this book, it is learned that the family called Dr. Vaughn Collin. It is learned that even in his youth, he aspired to be a medical doctor. The pranks that were played and the education that the children received while at sea are greatly detailed in this book. The ship frequently made return journeys to certain ports, and the family was well acquainted with such cities as Buenos Aires, Antwerp, Montevideo, and Amsterdam. Long before Harriet wrote this book, she left the ship and attended Bucknell College and did graduate work at New York University. She became an advisor to women students at Columbia University, where her husband, Milton Davies, was a dean. Widowed early in the marriage, it was a natural thing for Dr. Vaughn to ask his sister to maintain a guardianship of his children when he married Peggy. So she was in New York. Dr. Vaughn was back here. Dr. Vaughn wrote many checks for the children's education and expenses as they lived hundreds of miles away in New York. Dr. Vaughn would also send small checks of allowances for each, and he would always remember his niece, Elspeth, as the children were all raised together. It was also Harriet who brought the children from his first marriage to Marion to visit their father and make sure that they traveled safely on the trains of the day. And so when they came here, when I started my research and I found this lady that was one of Dr. Vaughn's daughters, I was able to call her and talk with her. And her memories of coming to Marion to visit her father, maybe for just 2 weeks at a time. And she said, we went to the swimming hole. Now, I don't know where the swimming hole was, but she called it the swimming hole. And she said, we went to the movie theater with a bunch of farmers. And, they did go up on the rooftop garden. And, since her father grew up on board a ship, he also knew about the stars and the heavens and everything. And so he would train them and teach them about those kinds of things. So they enjoyed that. And they were told that Mrs. Wilson did not get up until the afternoon. So they were told to be very quiet and always be polite, not cause any problems. And it's not a mistake that I called her Mrs. Wilson, because that's what he told the children to call her. She never took the name Vaughn. She was always Wilson. And so that was a problem for me when I was doing my research trying to find her on the records, because I was looking for Vaughn sometimes and it was never there. So that was the memory of one of the children anyway. So later when Dr. Vaughn's father was widowed. He also went to live with Harriet. John Albert Vaughan, the master of the Lizzie Ross, died 6 months after his son in 1940 at the age of 99. And Harriet also reached the age of 99 at her death. Okay, now we come to, and I didn't have any pictures for Harriet. So that's why I've got this drawing here. This is where they're on board the ship. And the whole family is there, so I thought, well, that'd give you an idea of how they dressed and everything. Now, this is Elizabeth Hamilton Fryermuth. And this is a very appropriate place to talk about her. This autobiography of Elizabeth Hamilton and her husband, Harold T. Fryermuth, sheds yet another light on Peggy Wilson. The details are included in this first-hand account that reveal a Peggy that is far different from the picture drawn by Edgar Lee Masters in Mirage. Elizabeth Hamilton was born in Marion in 1904. She was the daughter of Burr and Etta Hamilton. Burr was a fireman and Etta a housewife. Elizabeth had graduated from Marion High School in 1921 and then went to work at the public library, this very building. 2 years later, Burr, then fire chief and also the town building inspector, was called to the home of Mrs. J. Wood Wilson. It seemed that Mrs. Wilson was having some problems with some property she owned, and she wanted his advice and opinions. Evidently, Peggy was quite pleased with Burr's recommendations, and she wanted to repay his kindness in some manner. Burr had mentioned Elizabeth and had given a glowing description of his daughter and her work at the library. Soon after this meeting, Peggy and her butler had her butler call Elizabeth at the library and invited her to come to the mansion to meet with Mrs. Wilson. This encounter allowed Peggy to observe and in fact interview the youthful Elizabeth. The two talked in Peggy's second-floor study, that same room, and at the conclusion of this first meeting, Peggy asked Elizabeth if she would like to go to college. This was an opportunity that Elizabeth never thought would be possible for her. It was agreed upon that Elizabeth would attend Northwestern University. The reason they chose Northwestern University was because Peggy was actually friends with Cornelia Lunt, whose families had founded Northwestern University. All through her college years and later in life, Elizabeth kept up a correspondence with her benefactress. Elizabeth married Harold T. Fryermuth, also a member of the Marion graduating class, and the two moved away from their hometown. Her first book, The Wabash Knows the Secret, was published in 1950. Many of her stories had locations that were similar to Marion, and perhaps she was thinking of Marion as she described the settings. She eventually wrote 18 novels and this autobiography. It's about her and her husband as well. Because Elizabeth had saved the letters written by Peggy, and then she passed them on to her daughter, Libby Frank, it is possible to trace Peggy's movements in later life. Peggy had become a puzzle to local residents because her fate was never known. It was through these letters, with postmarks and dates, return addresses, and other pertinent information, that it was possible to discover facts about Peggy in her final years. Thus, the mystery was solved. And I remember when I started this research, I talked with Dick Simons, that was then the Grant County historian. And he said to me, he says, well, you know, nobody knows what happened to Peggy. They know Jay Woods out there at the old IOOF cemetery, and I think people knew that Dr. Vaughn was out there too. I'm guessing they knew that, but they didn't know what happened to Peggy. So that was really something that I thought, okay, that was a challenge, and I wanted to see maybe I could find out where she was. And I wasn't really going to talk about this today, but it turns out because she kept her name Wilson, we could find her on the Salt Lake City records. So we found out that she was in New York in 1952. She passed away. And she's buried at the Gate of Heaven Cemetery in Westchester County, which is just outside New York City. It's run by St. Patrick's Cathedral from New York. So Elizabeth Hamilton Fryermuth lived and worked for many years in Dayton, Ohio. Then she and her husband moved to Pelham, New York, and eventually retired to Connecticut. Elizabeth died in 1992. And because she wrote this book, she mentions her daughter, Libby Frank, and it tells where she lives, the town. And I wondered, well, do you suppose there's still a Libby Frank in that town? And I called and found her. And so she's the one who helped us figure out just exactly what happened to Peggy. And because I contacted her, she had all these letters that Peggy had written to her mother. So she asked if I would like to have copies of them, which I said, well, most certainly I would. So I'm going to read you a little bit. This is Peggy's voice now. These are letters that she wrote to Elizabeth Hamilton Fryermuth. This one was written in 1950. She was living at the Hotel Winthrop on Lexington Avenue at 47th Street, New York. She said, your sweet newsy letter has given me no end of pleasure. Through the years, I have sent many loving thoughts and many times said, "Dear God, bless and protect Elizabeth and her family," even though I did not know about Libby until Friday. However, I always pictured you as a perfect mother. The first day we met, I felt there was a spiritual bond between us, and knowing such bonds are never broken, you were never far away from me. I know nothing about Marion, and my friends there all have their own interests. And besides, I was for years here in New York while Dr. Vaughn was ill, going from one hospital after another, then back to my apartment where I nursed him. He had a horror of trained nurses. Then in 1940, he died. My health was rather shattered at the time, so I stored my furniture and have lived in a hotel ever since. For the past few years, I have been an invalid, and now my doctor does not allow me to have visitors, use telephone, or do any of the pleasurable things in life. Not that telephoning is pleasurable. It has always been my pet aversion, but I'm emphasizing my isolation. My nurse is about the only person I see, and letter writing is strictly taboo. The length of this one partially measures my appreciation of your sweet story. Now I'm a little tired. Bless you all, and all love, Peggy. And then I just want to read from another letter that she wrote about a year later from that. In 1951, she's still at the Winthrop in New York. And this is after Elizabeth has that first book published, Wabash Knows the Secret. And she says to her, she said, "We do need a return to decent culture in our beloved country. We have abundant pressure groups to flood our land with foreigners who come for one reason only, material gain, and many are wholly unprepared spiritually, and we have not been able so far to spiritualize the tremendous energy this vast group has released. Another thing," this is about her book, "I forgot, I'm getting very tired. Many of the Rich Valley names I knew as I worked all that territory selling subscriptions of the Plain Dealer for several summers the day after school closed. I did it to buy books, etc. You see, I taught up until I married Jay Wood, and also paid my own way for several terms at Indiana University." And she did go to Indiana University. I stopped at their library and I got some information there, and she was there for a couple of years. "And I never should have left teaching, or rather should have returned to it after Jay Wood died." Well, that would have left out Edgar Lee Masters and all this other stuff. "I have much to say, but no more energy. Love to each of you, and a kiss for Libby. Peggy." So that's kind of another view of Peggy than you get from some of these other things, like from Edgar Lee Masters. Okay, so now we come to Edgar Lee Masters, the biography that Herb Russell wrote. And I don't know if the library has a copy of this, Mary, or not, but maybe it'd be a good idea to get. There's a big section in here on Peggy. It goes through all throughout his life, not just Peggy, but there is a nice section in there. Dr. Russell had read Edgar Lee Masters' autobiography, Across Spoon River, and noted that he had ended his accounting with the year 1917. Masters wrote the book in 1936. This made Russell pause and wonder, well, what was going on in all those years in between? Starting his search in the 1970s, Russell went meticulously through the available research in the Newberry Library in Chicago and the University of Texas in Austin at the Harry Ransom Research Center for Humanities. These two locations held the majority of Masters' personal papers. Masters was not only a prolific writer of prose and poetry, but he had a voluminous amount of personal correspondence that he saved throughout his lifetime. Ingeniously, for perhaps his ego directed him to do so, he usually made carbon copies of his side of the written dialogue. I don't know how many people do that. It was while perusing this material that Russell found that Masters was quite taken with a young woman in 1919. Trying to discover her identity, Russell soon found that there was a letterhead with the name Lillian P. Wilson and the address of 723 West 4th Street, Marion, Indiana. Soon after, bits and pieces of the puzzle began to take shape. There was a sizable amount of written communication between the two lovers. Russell spent 5 summers at the Harry Ransom site researching the material in the Masters file. Of course, all of this was not about Peggy, but for the years she was most strongly attracted to the writer, she had a considerable share in the space of the files. By 2001, Russell's work was complete, and he had compiled, written, and published Edgar Lee Masters' biography. Although the scandal of the Peggy-Edgar affair was fairly common knowledge in Marion during the 1920s, academics, historians, and contemporary Marionites did not know of it. Herb Russell is hailed as a Masters scholar and has done exemplary work with his biography. He has been a professor at universities in Illinois and is currently director for college relations at John A. Logan College in Carterville, Illinois. Dr. Russell delighted an audience at the Hostess House in the summer of 2001. It's hard to believe it was that long ago. He detailed Master's life, focusing on the times that Master spent with the mistress of the 4th Street mansion. His program was generously sprinkled with humorous accounts of the couple's adventures as well as misadventures, and thoroughly enjoyed by all. And so in this picture up here, Herb Russell's in the middle, and on this side is Libby Frank. That's Elizabeth Pamela Frank's daughter. She was there at the time she came to visit, and that's me back then too. So that's what I have to share with you about the literary connections to the Hostess House. Are there more? The search continues.
We've got time for a few questions. If
I can take questions, sure. Anybody have a question? Yes.
What bank did J. Wood Wilson connected with to make all that money?
The Marion National Bank,
Really?
which is Ridley Tower today.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually he and John L. McCullough came here to do glass factories. They built glass factories. That's how they started.
Oh, really?
And they sold out to Ball Brothers in 1904. And when they did that, McCullough went to Europe for a year with his wife and daughter, and then J. Wood stayed here and got them settled for the bank. And there was a bank there at the corner where the Ridley Tower is now, a 3-story bank. And they were there for until they took that building down, and then in 1916 started building the new building, which opened in 17, but J. Wood had died in that winter.
Right.
Yeah, that's where it was. But they own lots of other things too. They own lots of businesses and had a lot going on.
Is there some of the information about them in the Grant County history books?
Well, yes, you could search and find it, yeah.
Well, I have the original books.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, you could, then there's...
I've overlooked them.
Well, there's a page, I can think of one, I can't remember which volume that is, that has photographs of them, and then there's like one page of information on
Sure.
McCullough and Wilson. Mm-hmm. Yeah. PJ?
Did she make any provision for the Hostess House when she became an invalid? I mean, did she sell it to anyone? Did she leave it to a family member? Did she abandon it?
She had to go, but what she wanted Edgar Lee Masters to do back in several years before was to break the will so that she could sell the house. And of course he didn't do anything about it, but then she did go to court and she got it changed so she could sell it in the 40s. And there we have a picture, a photograph of, there's a big for sale sign across the balcony, and it went on for sale. Now the house cost $135,000 to build in 1912. It was sold, the house, which is on 2 city lots, the lot behind it where the carriage house was, with the carriage house on it, and they had servants' quarters upstairs, and an empty lot across the street. All of it sold for $32,000. So she got, and this is in Edgar Lee Masters' book, and it's true. It's in there was a copy of J. Wood Wilson's will in the deed, and he had originally in his will given everything to Peggy. But the same day that he made the will, he went back and put a codicil on it and had it divided up between his wife and his family. He had brothers and sisters and nephews. And so Edgar Lee Masters gives a reason for that, because he did go through J. Wood's will when he got there. But he gave a reason for that. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. But he thinks Peggy had done something he was not happy about. So fill in the blanks. But then she was, she got half of the money. So that probably helped her finish out.
Didn't the house become abandoned at one point? I mean, how did that happen?
Well, it was Dr. Bond left in 39, and then the house was empty for maybe 2 years, and then when World War II started, there was a man from Chicago named Kreitzer, and he was doing a munitions kind of factory thing, and he came down, he rented the house and somebody was here in charge. I forget which realtor was in charge of things, or the lawyer that was here was in charge of it. So he rented the house for all the years in the war. And then when the war was over, the house was empty again. And the reason, and it was for sale then, the reason it never sold was because it took a train carload of coal a month to heat the house.
Whoa.
So it's kind of pricey.
Whoa.
And, but then you know, along came all these club women in Marion, and they said, well, you know, it's not fair. Our husbands have these clubhouses, and they can just go down there and everything's all ready for them. We have to get our houses ready and cook the food and do all this stuff. And they wanted a house for themselves too. And one of the husbands said, well, if they said, we don't have any money, we can't go buy it. And they said, well, if you form a holding company and sell shares, then you can take that money to the bank, get a mortgage, and you can get the house. And that's exactly what they did. So in 1950, they got the house, and Peggy got half the money, and these other relatives got the other money. So, yeah.
The Frymoods, were they a Wabash family? Since she wrote about, well, I've read her books.
Oh, yes, I don't know that she was, but it always talked about her being in Marion.
Yeah. Well, I think in my genealogy, I did run into that name up there.
Well, and Peggy was from Maryland, from Frederick, Maryland, and she came to Wabash because her sister was getting married, and she was to stand up with her sister. Her sister got married at St. Bernard's Catholic Church there, and so she was there, and that's how she got to Wabash, and she stayed there and taught school, and then she saved her money, went to IU, and came back, and she did all kinds of stuff, but yeah, so she was from Wabash, and see, Marie Doherty was from Wabash too.
Right.
And so she may have known her because of those connections.
I would just like to say, as a former school teacher in Wabash, there are some really smart women in Wabash who decided to come to Marion and find the money. So,
Yes.
Several years back, I was involved in a little history project with some of these about Peggy, and I thought that what I was told is that she met the Dr. Vaughn in a really unusual way.
Well,
Have you heard that?
the way she met him was she was in New York, and she had an appendix attack, and so he was her surgeon.
So I just always love the romantic aspect of that. You know, we all fall with our doctors,
Well,
right? Is that what
it
she
didn't
meant?
bother him, and it didn't bother her that he was a married man.
But I mean, they met, that's an unusual way to meet.
Yeah,
You know, he's her surgeon. I thought that was interesting.
but but he divorced. He sued his wife for divorce in May, and in October he was here at the house with Peggy, and they got married at the Hostess House.
So that was some surgery. I mean,
Yeah.
you know?
Is there any reason she wasn't buried with either husband out there at IOOF?
I don't know why. Well, at some point, Dr. Vaughn's first wife, who had died during a surgery herself in 1919, her remains were brought here and they were put in the mausoleum. And then he had his little son, had graduated from college, and he was working for Union Carbide when we were gearing up for World War II. And they didn't handle the materials safely then. And so he breathed these things in, and it consumed his lungs, and he died in 1942, just a couple years after his father. And his remains were there. Now, I think they were all cremated. I don't know for sure, but I think they were. But I don't know if she thought there wasn't room for her there or what, but anyway, yeah. And then, see, she kind of went around. She was raised Catholic. When she came here, she was her sister's wedding at the Catholic Church. When she was married by the Presbyterian minister from Wabash. That's who married her. I think the same one, maybe, that married Marie. And then she mentioned the Christian Scientists. She had them in because I found bills that were to the Christian Science people. And then now she's in a Catholic cemetery. So I don't know. But I don't know the reason why she did that, unless it was just an easy thing for her to do.
Well, where is her son buried at? Is he in New York there also? She had the one son, didn't she?
No, she didn't have any children.
No.
No, she had no children.
Okay.
No, there were no children. Jay Wood had no children, and she had no children.
Did the Great War impact her life?
It did. It made her stay home. Yeah.
Home here in Marion or somewhere else?
She was here. And, everybody got very patriotic, just like we did when 9/11 happened. Remember how that happened? I can't imagine the Great War happening. But she had people to the house, and they made comfort kits for our boys. Marion boys were going to France, and they made comfort kits. She had musicals on the stage upstairs, And then they passed the hat for silver. This was the way it was written up in the papers. That was the language they used. So yes, they all did become very, very much so. And she pretty much stayed home. She didn't travel so much during the war. Now her brother, Sumner, was living at the house with her when Jay Wood died. And he had come out here to run one of the cabinet companies or something that Jay Wood had, one of the other little businesses that he had. And so he was here with her when that happened, but then he left and went in the service. And it was because I found information about him that I located his son, and his son has come out here a couple of times. And he's the one that gave us he had received the Oriental rug that's up in Peggy's study. It's original to the house. His family had received that after she passed, so that's up there. And then he's brought us other things, little things that we appreciate. So yeah, so that was interesting. Yeah, she did pretty much, when she met Edgar Lee Masters, that was about the first time she was out and about doing things again, 1919.
Is it known if she was a patron of this library when she was here in Marion? Like, was she ever in here much at all?
I don't know. I didn't read any connections with the library. I wouldn't be surprised that she was down here, but I never found that. She never came here. She asked for, you know, Elizabeth to come to her house. Mm-hmm. But she might have been.
I heard the story that she came from Wabash and came into town and she had a plan to sell subscriptions. And she went, is that a true story that she, right after that man, she knew what she was doing?
Well,
I'm sorry, I'm still stuck on that part.
well, in 1908, the Indianapolis Star, and this was a big question because we didn't know. We heard magazines, papers, what. In 1908, the Indianapolis Star had a contest for women between the ages of 18 and 45. Whoever sold the most subscriptions would get a tour of Europe. So they were going to give this prize to 12 women. And I didn't bring any of that material with me, but they had beautiful illustrations in the Indianapolis Star of the women that were trying. And every week they would put out how many votes these people were getting, because their subscriptions counted as a vote. There were ballots in the paper that they could send in. So Peggy had checked with all these political people in Wabash, and she really wanted to win. You know, you could just tell she was really out for it. And so she'd heard about Jay Wood over here because it was said that Jay Wood had a kind ear, and a lot of people would go to him for advice. And so she thought, well, I'd like to go over and see Jay Wood over there at the bank. So she went over. You know, she had a red hair and ringlets. She had this effervescent, bubbly personality and a wonderful, tickly voice. And she went in and talked to him. And by the time she left, you know, he said he would help her. And I think, I can't prove it, but I think he probably bought a lot of subscriptions. And I also think he probably told her that because they posted every week how many votes these women had, I think he probably told her, well, why don't you hold back and not give all your votes out, you know, so people get a false sense of security there. That's my guess. That's my guess. I don't know. But he kind of hinted, you know, the thing was, when you go through all these old newspapers, they told so much back then. And they had the society news, and they interviewed people, and they would interview them. They're like, Jay Wood and Peggy were walking down the street, and a reporter would come up and say, well, how was Europe, or how was this or that, and just talk to them right then. And so it's just amazing the things that you can find out, but it takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
But it was one of the most fascinating, fun things I've ever done. That was a kind of a scholastic type of thing.
Super job. You did an excellent job.
Thanks.
We got time for maybe one more questions.
Anybody else? Did I answer your question about the Great War?
Yes.
Okay.
Am I right in thinking that there was a murder in the house?
You are right. Yes. 1978. Yeah. Do you want details?
Oh, well. It was like a Halloween thing, if I could.
Yeah, well, it was, there had been a wedding there that night. And we had, for a long time, from this time the house started, there was a housekeeper, a live-in housekeeper. Lived upstairs in one of the rooms upstairs. And there had been this wedding, and she'd gone up for the night. And her name was Jessie Saul. A young man who'd had his 21st birthday, had been celebrating downtown. He lived off the 3rd Street alley. And because he had a little too much to drink, that night, he walked up the 4th Street alley. And we think that perhaps he had come by the Hostess House and didn't know what it was and just curious. And on the alleyway, that's where the fire escape is, on the alley side. So we think he came up, we know he came up the fire escape and walked into where Jessie was. And of course, she was startled. And we think she reacted, and then he killed her. And so it took him a couple days. The whole town was scared to death of what was going on. It was a very scary time. And then they did get him, and he served. He was sentenced to 60 years, but it's my understanding he served 30 and is out.
Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Sharon. For future events, follow us on Facebook. We're posting everything there. We have bookmarks and punch and cookies still outside. Also, our social media information's out there. We also have an Instagram. So, thank you again for coming.
Thanks. Thank you so much.